So, Mr. Lamb, obviously you only took office 2 years ago, but over the past 4 years, it's no secret that there's been a lot of changes to the United States. What have you seen change in the United States over the past 4 years, not only within your own district, but around the country as a whole?
The feeling that people out there have in my district, when I get to talk to them, people who don't like or pay attention to politics that much, just normal people, is that something about America has really changed and is somehow reflected in what's happening in Washington, D.C., and that instead of sort of one country filled with people of maybe two different opinions, we're almost getting to the point where people feel like there are two different countries, and they don't like that feeling, and they want us to kind of put a stop to it and try to not necessarily get back to how things used to be, because they've never been perfect, but to build a new future where it's possible to have disagreements that are based a little bit more on respect, and that frankly is just a political debate that's a little easier for people to follow. They find all the lies and recriminations very confusing and exhausting, I think.
This election feels different than it has in previous years, this presidential election. There's a lot of emphasis on a battle for the soul of the nation, as some people have put it. What exactly is at stake, and what makes this election so different than previous years?
Yeah, well, I think it would have been important anyway, but the pandemic really raises the stakes. It's no exaggeration to say that this is probably the single biggest challenge our nation has faced since World War II, when you look at both the health and economic effects of it. So, we've lost 220,000 of our fellow Americans. That is a death toll that is not only higher than Vietnam, but higher than World War I. It is right up there with kind of the worst moments in American history. You add to that literally tens of millions of people have lost their jobs or their health insurance or a family member or some combination of those things this year, and that's a total disaster. And even more people than that have had someone in their family get extremely sick from the coronavirus and recover but still be impacted. This is a serious long-term threat to our way of life, and the reason for that is just that our economy still very much rests on the confidence that people have to just go out and spend their money. I think sometimes people think, especially well-educated kids like we have here at Fox Chapel, they think that tech is changing and the world is changing and things are different now. But there's one way in which the world is very much the same, is that our economy is 70% consumer driven. You've got to be able to go out and eat in a restaurant, put gas in your car, buy groceries, buy holiday presents, all the kind of stuff. And the coronavirus has shaken people's confidence to do those very things. They're doing them, but just much less. And even a tiny adjustment there, that can mean human lives. It can mean jobs, meaning that you take 3 or 4% off of your own budget and play that out across the country, hundreds of thousands of jobs. And once people are unemployed, it becomes harder and harder for them to get back to where they were the longer it goes. And that's what we really are looking at as we enter the second phase of COVID, is not only a great risk to our own sort of health and well-being in our lives, but the potential of long-term double-digit unemployment that affects families for a generation, makes it hard for them to buy the house or stay in the house they're in, have a car that works, the things that just make American life what it is. And I guess to tie it back to your question, it's just very obvious at this point that we have candidates in this election with two very different approaches to that problem. And I won't even make the case for either one, in this forum. I don't want to be too political, but the incumbent candidate basically says we're turning the corner. What he has done is good and has worked, and we're going to be fine, and the governors can handle the rest. The other candidate doesn't say that. He wants to take more responsibility for a stronger federal response. And so I think every American can think about whether they're satisfied based on what they've seen in the last 6 months or so, or they would like to see a much stronger response, and that'll be the choice in this election.
Doubling back a little bit, I think you bring up a good point in terms of political discourse. It can sometimes feel that there's more yelling and screaming than there is actual meaningful, honest conversations, and perhaps the worst example of that was the first presidential debate of this year. So just how important to healing this nation, like you said, are those meaningful, honest, quiet conversations?
They're very important. If you just take my case as an example, I ran for Congress in a district that President Trump won by 19 percentage points in November of 2016. And it was March of 2018 when we had my special election. So that's like less than 18 months, pretty short period of time. Now, a typical political analyst or someone who only watches cable news would say, that was a Trump district. That is a red district. Those are Trump voters. And so what we set out to do should have been impossible. I mean, that's tens of thousands of votes, 19 percentage points. It's a lot of individual people. But the fact is, I believed, because I grew up around here and I knew some of these areas, that if you went out and you talked to people face to face, and you showed them respect, and most of all listened, and just said, what do you think the problems are? How can I help with that? Like, what would you like to see in your next member of Congress? That people were still open-minded enough to give you a shot and maybe switch from one side to the other in such a short time span. And that turned out to be true. It doesn't turn out to be true for every single voter, but just enough of them that we could make up that deficit. And I think that is what we are going to have to do kind of year in, year out for a pretty long time. You're never going to eliminate the base of people who are extremely loyal to President Trump, or who practice a type of politics that is very divisive and difficult to deal with. But there's a vast, vast middle ground of people who simply want to hear some common sense and talk some common sense and have us listen to them a little bit more and represent them a little bit better. And I think one of the only ways to reach them is in person, just because the sort of national media environment has become itself so kind of fragmented and difficult for people to follow.
A lot of this political discourse today that has become so divisive, of course it exists among common people, but it stems from the top. How important is bipartisanship to healing this nation?
I think some people talk about bipartisanship and they picture these sort of kumbaya moments in Washington, D.C., where you have a member of one party kind of having a drink and joking around with the other party, and things won't seem as bad. The real reason that bipartisanship is so important is because it's essential to getting important things done. It's just very rare in a country such as ours that you have one party controlling both sides of Congress and the presidency for very long. Usually only happens for 2 years at a time, maybe 4, and even that doesn't happen all that often. And so if you take a hard look at things and say, well, I'm setting out to be in politics not just to give speeches or go on TV or write tweets, but to actually pass bills and try to affect people's lives for the better, you're going to have some support from the other party to do that. It's just the way our system works. We've got majority rule in the House. Senate usually takes 60 votes to get things done. They're on different electoral calendars. The president's on a different electoral calendar than them. So you need that ability to reach across and make a deal. It's just how our system was built, and that hasn't been changed at all. But something about our society, and especially media environment, is becoming kind of so siloed for people, or they're in kind of a news and information bubble of their own, that I think it's just a little bit harder for people to trust in that or believe in it anymore. And so it's probably even more important that we go out of our way to try to show it to the American people, that this is how this thing really is supposed to work. And not only is there nothing wrong with that's a good thing. That shows us doing our jobs when we actually do the work to reach a deal with each other.
Like you said, there's been a lot of changes to how we view politics in the past 4 years. This current administration has in some ways divided us. I'm wondering when you think we'll return to any sense of normalcy in terms of unification, and if that normalcy does exist, or even if it ever existed. What does that look like, and will we ever reach that point?
Yeah, I'm not really sure there is like one point in American history where you can say there's normalcy. When I was in grade school and high school, Bill Clinton was being impeached, and there was the 2000 recount from Florida with Bush and Gore. I mean, there were a lot of crazy things that were happening then too, and so I think that it's always important to remember that our system of government was built knowing that people were going to disagree and fight with each other a lot. And it was designed simply to try to contain those disagreements, to try to keep it from spilling outside the halls of government and into the streets in the form of kind of like civil conflict, and also to keep one side in that fight or debate from becoming so powerful that they were actually tyrannical towards someone else. And so our system is very frustrating, especially to people who are activists around one particular cause or issue, because our system is very slow and really designed more to prevent concerted action than it is to encourage it. So our system has held, even under 4 years of this president who's challenged everything that we kind of took for granted. But I think going forward, I'm confident that we will change the style of politics or the rhetoric or the temperature if we want to. And the reason I'm confident about that is just not having to do with like the goodwill of legislators or anything, but the people themselves are really fed up and tired of this stuff. They really are. And they sort of blame people on both sides. But as someone who's just knocked on a lot of doors and talked to a lot of normal people about politics in the last couple of years, I know that there's a market there for politicians behaving more respectfully, more focused on the issues, more sort of even-keeled. And if more people are willing to kind of see that and take advantage of it, I think a lot of these things will start to fix themselves.
What do you hope that people, everyday people and politicians alike, will learn from and take from the current experience in the United States right now moving forward?
I think a couple of things. One is I hope everybody looks at 2016 and realizes how important it is to vote and be part of the solution, because 2016 was a very close election decided in a couple of key states, including our own. And even though Secretary Clinton won the popular vote, she lost the election because in states like this, literally 2 or 3 people per voting precinct favored Trump over her. If you take Trump's lead in Pennsylvania and spread it out across every polling place, it's literally only 2 or 3 votes per polling place. It was that close, And in my own first race, there were 220-some thousand votes cast, and late that night of the election, there were 95 votes separating me from my opponent. It's hard to even describe how close that is. And so nobody should ever believe that their own individual vote does not matter, because it very much does. I think a positive lesson to draw from the past 4 years is the American people are very capable of solving a lot of problems on their own and doing a lot of good things, even when Washington is not doing a good job. And I'll just say Washington because even though a lot of people focus on the president, there is also gridlock in Congress that has not really covered us with glory and has made us kind of slow to respond to the needs of the American people. But a lot of people got to work, and if you travel around this area, you see in a lot of the smaller towns and Main Street business districts and stuff, people just kind of taking things into their own hands and building a new world based on kind of new technologies and clean energy and a food culture, and there's kind of all these impressive areas of growth that people have just taken on for themselves. So that happened, no matter who was the president, which I think is a good thing. But then what the pandemic shows us is that there is still an essential role for strong federal government leadership when it comes to national crises. The American people just couldn't stop the pandemic on their own. No country's citizens could. It's such a big and complex problem that you needed someone willing to take on all the different parts of it and take responsibility. My view is that we haven't gotten that yet.
What made your campaign so successful in many ways is, like you said, you spent the time to listen and talk to those individuals within your district and not just listen to the polls, but you made sure that the best interests of the people in your district were being represented through you. What specifically do you think needs to change in politics to better represent the individuals of the country?
A big part of it has to do with just listening to people. They'll tell you where they want the focus to be, and it's not always where you think it should be. In my case, for example, when I first began as a candidate, I started to go all these different towns and areas, an hour or even hour and a half outside of the city of Pittsburgh that were in my first district. And I sort of thought people would talk about specific issues or like specific kind of economic needs or problems. And I just noticed time and again that what people brought up more was this fatigue with the culture of kind of fighting and like partisanship in Washington, D.C. And that was a really clear message to me that, above and on top of any particular issue, people would just really like to see a representative behave in a certain way and treat the other side with respect, regardless of which side they're coming from. And I don't think all my colleagues appreciate or know that or understand the depth of how people feel about that. But if someone runs against them who does, I think they're going to lose because people want to see politicians, behave in a certain way. But then I also think, in just knowing what I know of history in this area, I've got a family that's been involved in politics for a few generations now. There was a time when we were just kind of closer to the ground, especially as Democrats. Labor unions were stronger. Our societies were a little bit more organized around institutions like churches and things like that. And there was a stronger Democratic Party apparatus that just really represented people at a local level in the most basic sense of that term. And I think political leaders back then might have had a better feel for what the top priorities of the community really are when it comes to, just those core issues like who's going to be better for your paycheck, who can I really trust for the well-being of my family, and over time somehow politics sort of drifted away from that, and you had all these elections that were about, kind of more abstract like religious issues, or about guns, where the argument is somehow that one side is going to take your guns from you, which has really never happened. And so I think that drift away from the immediate needs and concerns that people have left them pretty angry, and kind of disappointed in both sides. So one of the big lessons to me is if we can build an organization or a community of people who care about politics, sort of inspired by what we had in the past, but something that's designed to fit the 21st century, it might help us all stay a little bit more focused on the true needs of the people that we represent. And so, you got to fight for people's jobs. And it means that although the national Democratic consensus, for example, might be against doing things like building new gas pipelines to supply energy to power plants in people's homes, around here, a lot of people get jobs from that kind of work. And if you're really trying to represent the people that live near you, you take the time to learn about them and their job and what it's like and how it impacts their family and what their other options might be before you just take the sort of national litmus test on some policy. And there's a lot of examples like that. So,
why do you think exactly the politicians' perception of what the needs of the people actually are has shifted so much, like you just said?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think the media and social media environments have a lot to do with it, in that you just don't have as much kind of local news culture now maybe as you used to, and so you have producers and personalities in places like Washington, D.C. and New York dictating what a lot of us see and read and experience. And social media adds a whole nother difficult layer on top of that. And so if you're not going out and really checking in real life and in person with people about how they feel and what they think, you can fall victim to just these kind of national narratives that might not be all that well suited to where you live and where you represent. So I think that has something to do with it. It becomes a question of focus and like awareness. And there are ways that we can address that. Myself, like I had, I think, 17 town halls in the last 2 years in my district, including during the pandemic. We had to do them over the phone, but we still did them. And things like that they're very powerful. The example I always think of is in the height of the impeachment frenzy at the end of last year, when I would be in Washington, D.C., all day, every day, what people were talking about was impeachment and what was coming next and what was in the Mueller report and what was in all these different things of evidence or whatever. And then I'd come home and have a town hall, and 25 people would ask questions, whatever question they wanted, and not a single question would be about impeachment. And it was just a really powerful reminder to me that the things that people focus on in a place like Washington, D.C. can be very different than what people are thinking about in the area you represent. And you just have to stay conscious of that.
That relationship with media, in terms of what you talked about, politicians maybe aren't so sure about what people are thinking because they take social media specifically and make generalizations about groups of people. I think the relationship with media, and specifically social media, has been interesting, especially with my generation, because we're so heavily intertwined with that. Do you have any concerns about what social media or media in general pose to sort of the information we're getting? Are you worried that misinformation is too rampant? Maybe people don't understand how to get the right information or where the right information is? Or what concerns do you have in relation to that?
Yeah, I'm definitely concerned, and I think that social media platforms, Facebook sort of above all, but many of the platforms, we have to think about them, I think, a little bit the way we think about industry, manufacturing, power plants, in the sense that they provide an important service to our country, but they can pollute. They can have spillover problems that we need to regulate to make sure people are safe and getting the most benefit out of them. So the same way that we don't let some company that's making chemicals dump all their runoff in the Allegheny River, we should not let companies like Facebook use their algorithms to pollute our democracy or our news environment. But they are. I mean, they just simply are. And that's hard for the individual person to push back against or deal with because Facebook, it's not a group of people sitting around deciding what to put up and put down in California. It's all driven by these very complex algorithms that determine what you see when you sign on to Facebook. And other social media is the same. And there's no transparency around that. Nobody knows what it is that makes a million stories about Hunter Biden pop up on someone's feed versus some other topic. And so, people have a hard time pushing back against that. I think a simple thing is just holding them a little bit more responsible for their algorithms and the information that they publish. So I would just encourage anybody one day sign on to either nytimes.com or the Wall Street Journal, just to show you I'm not trying to be ideological about this. And you'll see that they don't really have many advertisements that would even come close to being misinformation. They have advertisements for products and stuff, but they are publishers, news publishers, and so they're held liable if they publish something that's factually wrong or incorrect and damaging to someone. And they have a subscription model, so you or I have to pay for being on the New York Times or Wall Street Journal. They have a little bit of free contact, but they make money from subscriptions. Facebook is free. It makes its money from advertising. Advertisers want to be on Facebook because so many people will click on stuff. And so Facebook's incentive really is to put things out there that are very inflammatory and get a quick and heavy emotional response from someone that makes them click on them. And Facebook is not liable for misinformation or false information the way that newspapers are. So there was a reason for that historically, but I think it becomes time to, since Facebook is a source of news for so many people, at least equate them with the news publishers and see if we can get better results. And if you've been following the news of what they've been doing lately in terms of limiting certain stories, freezing accounts and stuff, it just shows you they have the power to do it when enough pressure is applied.
2020 has been a crazy year for everyone, especially when you throw in the fact that it's an election year on top of the pandemic and on top of everything that's happened in the fallout of George Floyd's death. I think a lot of people feel disconnected from the country right now. The United States is first in COVID deaths. We're working with justice systems that clearly don't work for everyone in the form of George Floyd's death. And like you said, or alluded to, we have leadership right now that critics would charge failed to provide level-headed leadership throughout all of it. You served first as captain in the Marine Corps, and now you serve as representative of PA 17th District. What exactly do you think it means to be patriotic in 2020?
I think that at its core, what it means to be patriotic is to face the fears and the doubts that you just mentioned and recognize that throughout our history, generations of great Americans of all types have felt those same feelings. So there's nothing wrong with looking at what happened to George Floyd or all of the many events that have occurred in the last few years and feeling down about it and wishing that they didn't happen and wondering kind of deeply within yourself if there really is anything we can do or if it's a lost cause. There's nothing wrong with feeling that. The only wrong thing would be to give in to that or surrender to it or submit to it. And I think if anyone looks back in American history and thinks of the moments that would make us the most proud, the idea of people storming the beaches at Normandy in 1944, or civil rights marchers marching through the South, for years and years and years at a time, beginning in the 50s and going all the way through the 60s until, think about what it would have felt like to see all that and then watch Martin Luther King be assassinated at the end of it and the depths of despair that people would have felt then. And yet they never gave up. They never gave up. And serving in the House of Representatives, I stood right alongside a person named John Lewis, who was there, on the bridge at Selma and had his head, practically beaten in with a police officer's baton. And not only did he never give up, he joined the government. He said to his own community, yes, I know this stuff is wrong, and I know the odds are stacked against us here in America. We all know that. And the way to change it is by getting involved and trying to be part of the solution. And so I always look at him and say, man, if this guy who grew up on a farm, I think in Mississippi, and kind of came from nothing and worked for everything he had, only to be beaten down time and again for years, if that guy believed that joining our government and doing public service and serving in Washington, D.C. was worth it and important to his community and the people he loved, then I've got to believe it. I've never faced anything like John Lewis faced. And I think that's true for a lot of us. We have our problems. But I can tell you, before he passed away, he stepped out into the streets of Washington, D.C., and he was tremendously proud with what he saw, the peaceful protests and the mobilization. And that sort of gave me faith that as much as that stuff shined a light on what was wrong with our country, it also definitely displayed a lot of the things that are right about our country, and it gives us the materials to build with going forward.
Right, so like you just said, one of the keys to moving forward is not losing hope in this country and thinking that there is still change that can be made that can improve this country. But a lot of young people are growing up in these formative years where, like I said, the coronavirus is raging on, there's protests going on because of the injustices that have happened. Do you worry that, especially if President Trump is reelected, do you have any concern as to whether this next generation of voters, this next generation of Americans who may be my age and younger, do you worry at all that they're losing hope in this country and that hope might not be recovered?
I know this has been a tough year for a lot of people, and I don't want to downplay that, but I think the point that I am trying to make is that whole question of what to do about it and whether we're willing to surrender to these sort of feelings of being overwhelmed or intimidated or just despairing, that's a choice that we all have to make, to be honest with you. It really is. And in the darkest times of our history, Americans have time and again made the choice not to give up. And that's what made this country really what it is. And I think Eleanor Roosevelt during World War II and the Depression would just always remind people of the phrase that it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. And if you do that, I still believe we are so much more fundamentally better off than almost any place in the world in terms of just the quality of resources and life that we have in this country, no matter how bad it's gotten. There are people all over the world that would kill to get the chance to live here. And so if we just mobilize what we have right here available to us, we're going to be just fine. And our history proves that. In some ways, we're getting the chance to live through history. We don't never want bad things to happen, but they have happened. And the way that we respond to this coronavirus, the way that we respond to the challenge of racial justice and economic inequality in this country, and especially the way we respond to the long-term threat of climate change, is going to define us. And our children and grandchildren will look back on us, I think, in much the same way we look back at the World War II generation and just say, thank God for them. Thank God they didn't back down when it really counted.
So young people have in many ways been at the forefront in pushing for change in this country. Gen Z has been, over the past 4 years even, involved in protests in regards to climate change, gun control, and most recently, racial injustice. What do you make of Gen Z's involvement in politics now? Does that give you hope for the future of this country? How do you feel about young people's involvement in politics right now?
I think it's very promising, and I've gotten the chance to talk to some of the students who are very much involved in gun safety campaigns in response to what happened in Florida. And at the last March for Our Lives that I was at here in Pittsburgh, I talked to them a little bit about how this cause that you're involved in really is a marathon. It's not going to end when you graduate high school and you move on to college and you want to do other things, or your mind wanders, or you leave town. I think that, to me, the lesson of the civil rights movement is probably the most powerful one for everyone to look at and try to learn from. Martin Luther King and all the people who were involved with him, they were taking risks with their own lives and safety and boycotting and protesting and organizing in the 1950s, the mid-1950s. And it took them a decade, 10 years, just to get to a piece of federal legislation that kind of honored what they did, the Civil Rights Act. And then even 3 years after that, King was still fighting so hard on behalf of the people in his movement that someone decided they had to assassinate him. And it was that depth of commitment, and he inspired so many people that they just never gave up, and they got real things done. I mean, there are people in America today who are still safer and better off because of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, everything that they did for housing. It's still not perfect, but that was what it took to get those things done. And so I think the young people I see who are organizing around gun safety or the environment or all these things, my message to them is very simple. This country it's worth fighting for, and it has given us so much. I mean, we are such incredibly lucky people to be alive here and now in the United States of America, as opposed to anywhere else in the world and at any other time in history. Despite all our problems, we absolutely have what it takes to solve them. And the genius of America is that when we have major problems, our system is not designed to just have sort of one powerful person or one powerful institution that is responsible for that, and the rest of us just get to go kick back and take it easy. It demands all of us to step up and be part of it, whether it's through voting or community action or whatever it is. That's just how America works, and that's why we are so innovative and so powerful and able to assimilate so many different types of people from all around the world, of different races and cultures and languages. No one else has ever done that, especially at this size. I mean, we really are the ultimate startup, or unicorn, to use like business terms. That's what America is. And if people just give up on that, if they just lose hope or they find it all too overwhelming, we're going to become a very different and worse place. And we don't have to do that. Bill Clinton's famous line was, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be cured with what's right with America. And that is just a simple truth that you need to think about and understand, and just take it from me. Don't give up. I mean, just don't give up.